Iran is now openly threatening to strike directly at Ukraine after Ukrainian drones hit Russians in the Caspian Sea. Zelensky said that Vladimir Putin is preparing a mobilization in Russia and is waiting for North Korean soldiers to be sent to fight against Ukraine. Vladimir Putin used the president of Kazakhstan's calls to end the war to justify continuing it instead. And British intelligence is already practically shouting that Russia is preparing a military provocation against Europe. While in Romania, Russian drones have been shot down for the third day in a row, which are attacking the country. Today, July 26, several alarming signals came together into one story. And I would say this story is Vladimir Putin is preparing an escalation. At the same time, Ukrainian strikes continue to yield results. Last night, drones hit the Tavricheskaya TPP and Chernomorneftegas in the occupied Crimea, the Tumen oil refinery, and a bridge in the Donetsk region. Well, in Russia, the Wildberries marketplace hastily, for some reason, removed the military goods categories from its website, apparently to make it look like they're a civilian facility. Anyway, let's take a look. Let's do a roundup of the latest news for July 26th in this episode. What's important to know right now? My name is Alexei Pecci. Let's discuss all these topics together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel. We're moving towards 300,000 subscribers, and I would be grateful for your subscription. So, let's briefly sum up the day on July 26th. I'll start with the Iranian threat to Ukraine, because this is a fundamentally new turn in this war. Previously, Iran was fighting against the United States of America and hadn't formally targeted Ukraine, although it did help the Russians. Now, Iran is directly threatening Ukraine. The reason for these threats is the Ukrainian operation in the Caspian Sea on the night of July 25. Let me remind you that on that night, the Security Service of Ukraine struck an oil production platform at the Filanovsky field. The missile boat Molnia and two vessels, Port Olyatu and Begi, which were under international sanctions and were used to transport military cargo between Iran and Russia. So, Ukraine struck at the specific logistics route through which Iran supplies weapons to Russia, and Russia can provide Iran with everything it needs to survive under attacks from the United States of America. Tehran responded to this attack quite harshly, obviously, because their military logistics were clearly targeted. And now it has become clear that Ukraine can reach there as well. And now the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Iran has accused Ukraine of attacking its vessel, stating that as a result of the explosion on board, one sailor was killed and another was injured. And now Iran is calling the ship a commercial vessel, which allegedly has nothing to do with military supplies at all. They say we were just trading something with the Russians there. We won't say exactly what, but it's definitely not any kind of military goods. And now the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has described the strike as, quote, a hostile and criminal act. They classified it as a violation of the UN Charter and international maritime law, and called it an act of aggression that could, I quote, further ignite and spread the flames of war. A little later, the Iranian Foreign Ministry summoned Ukraine's acting chargé d'affaires and stated that Iran would defend its national interests and security without hesitation. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi called on the United Nations Security Council, the European Union and the international community to take measures against Ukraine and, of course, to condemn Kyiv. Meanwhile, media and telegram channels close to the Iranian authorities have already issued direct threats, including statements about the possibility of using Iranian ballistic missiles against Ukraine. In general, hotheads in Tehran are already calling on the authorities to attack Ukraine directly, saying there are ballistic missiles that can reach Kyiv, so let's attack. But a sober analysis is important here. Iran is unlikely to actually strike Ukraine. Right now, it is at war with the United States of America. Iran has other concerns, and it would be difficult for it to reach that far. The missiles would have to fly over Turkey. Would Turkey allow that? Unlikely. But the very fact of a public threat is an admission that Ukraine has hit a sore spot. Well, also don't forget, Iran already threatened Ukraine with missiles last year and never actually struck. Ukraine has now exposed and struck the channel through which military cooperation between Moscow and Tehran is taking place. By the way, Russian media today accidentally revealed how they think the true meaning of the Ukrainian operation. In their view, Kiev seeks to demonstrate its usefulness to Washington beyond Europe. In other words, by their logic, we're showing the United States that we are striking at that very Iranian-Russian alliance, which is also a problem for America. But that means that such an alliance really does exist, no matter how much Tehran insists that it was just a commercial vessel. And moreover, even American intelligence has repeatedly reported that yes, most likely it is through the Caspian that the Russians are helping Iran to wage war against the US in the Middle East. Now, the main news about the situation at the front and mobilization. Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, received intelligence briefings today about Russia's plans for this fall. And these plans do not involve peace. On the contrary, Vladimir Putin is preparing for a sharp escalation immediately after the elections to the State Duma of the Russian Federation. The president of Ukraine stated directly that Putin is laying the groundwork for expanding mobilization in Russia. And then he gave the casualty figures, which actually explain everything, why Putin needs this. According to Ukrainian intelligence, in less than 7 months of 2026, 221,000 people were recruited into the Russian army. And during the same period, Russia lost almost 225,500 occupiers. About 131,000 killed and around 93,000 wounded. So, recruitment into the army doesn't even cover the losses. The Russian army is shrinking faster than it can be replenished. Obviously, this trend leads to the army deteriorating and shrinking. For comparison, an assessment by the American Center for Strategic and International Studies says that by the middle of 2026, the total losses of the Russian army had already reached about 1.4 million people. That is 1.4 million. 400,000. Among them, 450,000 were killed. This is quite a conservative estimate. So Vladimir Putin needs someone to make up for the losses in the army if he really believes he can capture all of Donbass by the end of this year, as his own military has already promised him. And here comes the second element of this story. Volodymyr Zelensky stated, and I quote, "Russia wants to get another 30,000 soldiers from North Korea, and Russia has been preparing to receive them in the Voronezh region since June." So Vladimir Putin is plugging this personnel gap not only with his own Russian soldiers, but also with North Koreans. On the other hand, if Putin is once again bringing in North Korean soldiers, it means he will still try to plug the gaps in his army to the very end without declaring total mobilization. But the fact that mobilization is being prepared is already obvious. It seems to me what we discussed. Let's put it this way. On my YouTube channel, over the past few days, there was a separate episode specifically about mobilization in Russia. And there, it lays out all the arguments showing that yes, Putin is preparing for this mobilization. All the laws, regulations, and so on and so on. In general, go to the channel and be sure to watch one of the previous episodes. But that's not all. According to Volodymyr Zelensky, North Korea is preparing to transfer new launchers for ballistic missiles to Russia. And then Zelensky emphasized that this is a threat not only to Ukraine. Quote, "Russia is helping North Korea learn how to fight, improving their weapons, and giving them experience in real combat use of weapons. So, in exchange for soldiers and missiles, Pyongyang is getting invaluable combat experience, which it can later use in Asia, against South Korea, against Japan, and really against any of America's allies in general, Vladimir Zelensky boiled his message down to one main point. Here's another quote. It's important that we and our partners are able to put enough pressure on Russia so that the idea of ending this aggression becomes dominant. Thoughts about peace, not about additional Russian mobilization. Our long-range operations, our strikes on Russian infrastructure contribute to this. Let me remind you of the context here. Earlier, the American Institute for the Study of War reported that the Kremlin is already creating a legal framework for a new draft. In particular, on July 22, the State Duma of the Russian Federation passed a law in 3 readings in one day, sending convicted criminals for banditry and drug smuggling to the front. And also, the Russian National Guard is preparing bylaws so that during mobilization and wartime, they can crack down even harder on those Russians who might suddenly decide to protest. Well, Ukrainian intelligence mentioned the figure of at least 500,000 people for the autumn mobilization. Well, probably after the State Duma elections on September 20th. And here comes the logical continuation of the topic. This is a warning from British intelligence to all of Europe. British intelligence agencies believe that Vladimir Putin may enter into a direct confrontation with the North Atlantic Alliance in the coming months. The logic of this escalation is as follows. While Donald Trump is focused on the war against Iran, Vladimir Putin, according to sources, wants to test the strength of the new government of British Prime Minister Andy Burnham. Next, I will quote intelligence data from the UK, as reported by the Daily Mail. There is now a firm belief that Vladimir Putin is preparing some kind of direct confrontation with NATO within the next few months. According to intelligence assessments, a change of government in Britain will prompt Vladimir Putin to try to test Burnham and see if he can exploit any disagreements between the old and new administrations. Moreover, according to the Daily Mail, Moscow is already trying to deplete the resources of the United Kingdom by redirecting its shadow fleet of oil tankers around the English Channel. Well, sort of. In order to stretch British forces as much as possible. The new British Defence Minister Wes Streeting responded quite firmly. I'll quote him next. Russia should have no doubt about the determination of this government and this Prime Minister to stand up to Russian aggression not only in Ukraine, but also to any aggression against the United Kingdom and our allies. Well, here too, it's worth taking a sober look at all the circumstances. Russia is unlikely, of course, to seek a total war with NATO. It simply can't handle it. But isolated attacks like the recent drone strike on Romania can be used to split the North Atlantic Alliance on the issue of how to respond to all this. And importantly, increased tensions with NATO could serve as Vladimir Putin's political justification for that very mobilization. Well, I mean, everything is interconnected. Vladimir Putin needs a provocation against NATO, among other things, as a pretext to tell his feral populace that supposedly, look, now we're not just fighting Ukraine. The entire NATO bloc is surrounding us, they're attacking us, so I'm announcing an additional mobilization. And right away, there's fresh confirmation of this Putin tactic. Romania, for the 3rd day in a row, shot down a 3rd Russian drone that entered its airspace with an F-16 fighter jet in the Danube Delta. Well, and I think it's possible that Russia might be deliberately sending drones into Romanian airspace to test the reaction of NATO countries. Romania is a member of the alliance, and the fact that it has been shooting down Russian drones for 3 days in a row shows that Moscow is currently probing NATO. Right now. Meanwhile, Ukraine continues its attacks on the feral Russians. On the night of July 26, Ukrainian defense forces struck occupied Crimea and targets in the Russian rear. In occupied Crimea, drones hit the Tavricheskaya thermal power plant and facilities belonging to Chernomorneftgaz. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine confirmed the strike on the Tyumen oil refinery. In addition, there was a strike on a road bridge near Veselki in the occupied part of Donetsk region, which Russian troops use for military logistics. There was also a strike on a drone warehouse in the Chervonopopivka area and on a location where Russian personnel were concentrated in Podovka, Luhansk region. And here is a particular detail that explains the systematic actions of the armed forces of Ukraine. Last night, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, systems that increase the range and quality of control over Russian drones were also targeted, which Russia uses to strike Ukraine. In other words, we're targeting not only the drones themselves, but also, if you track the strikes on the occupied territories and deeper into Russia, we are also taking out the infrastructure that controls them. And here's an interesting point. All these strikes on logistics inside Russia have had a rather unexpected effect. They are hitting Vladimir Putin's war economy harder than expected. In particular, the Russians have unexpectedly started pulling some equipment and air defense systems away from the front line, even those with short range. Well, probably to redirect all of this to defend Russia itself from Ukrainian strikes. Western media are already openly writing that the campaign targeting Wildberries warehouses could undermine the regime of Vladimir Putin, because the war has reached Russia's middle class for the first time, which until now had not felt the war personally. And by the way, here's a telling detail about Wildberries. After the strikes by Ukrainian drones, after several of this company's rather huge warehouses have already been burned, Marketplace quietly removed from its website the section that was called Everything for the Special Military Operation. But at the same time, Marketplace of course continued to sell military goods, they just put them in the sports category now. So before, it was clearly labeled Everything for the SMO. And there you could find drones and bulletproof vests, and drop systems and fiber optics, and basically a whole bunch of stuff. And they didn't hide it at all. Now apparently, they've decided to pretend to be humane, to claim that they're just civilian facilities. They removed this section from the website, but these products are still being sold. So, publicly, this company is supposedly distancing itself from the war, but in reality, it continues to profit from it. The call by the president of Kazakhstan, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, to Vladimir Putin to end the war as soon as possible took an unexpected turn today. Let me remind you, the president of Kazakhstan at the forum in Omsk directly advised Vladimir Putin to freeze the war because it is already hitting Kazakhstan's wallet as well. I had a separate episode on this topic yesterday, so to avoid repeating myself, go and watch it if you missed it. Ukraine's reaction to Kassym-Jomart Tokayev's call is as follows. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha welcomed this initiative and thanked the President of Kazakhstan for his position. But the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin notably used Tokayev's words about freezing the war to his own advantage. The Kremlin presented it as if Russia is actually in favor of freezing the war. They say, well, we're not against it. Moscow actually sees this as securing the territories it has taken. Putin stated that he is not against freezing the war, but only after capturing all of Donbas. That's why he says, look, even the president of Kazakhstan says, let's stop the war. And to stop the war, the Ukrainians just need to give all of Donbas to the Russians. Well, and here it's important to understand the difference. When Tokayev says to freeze the war and return to the Istanbul Formula 2.0, he's talking about a ceasefire, right here and now. When Vladimir Putin invokes these words, he means something completely different. To freeze the front along the current line, at best, keeping everything he has captured and getting a break for new mobilization. These are actually two opposite things described with the same word, freeze. Vladimir Putin is already mocking the topic, saying, let's capture all of Donbas and then freeze it. That's exactly why Volodymyr Zelensky insists that we need to put pressure in such a way that thoughts of peace dominate Vladimir Putin's thinking, not about how to recruit another 500,000 mobilized Russian soldiers and 30,000 North Koreans. Continuation. Result. The situation as of today, July 26, is as follows. Ukrainian strikes are working, so much so that even Iran has been hit in a sensitive spot, threatening Ukraine today with strikes after its ships carrying military cargo for the Russians were sunk. Today, Ukraine struck occupied Crimea, targeting an oil refinery, logistics, and drone control infrastructure. Overall, the systematic campaign continues. But Russia готовится не к миру, а к эскалации. Владимир Путин создает правовую базу для новой мобилизации уже осенью. Recruitment no longer even covers the losses that Russia is suffering at the front. Putin is waiting for 30,000 North Koreans and new ballistic missile launchers from Kim Jong-un. Well, British intelligence warns that Putin may stage a provocation against NATO. Romanian F-16s, which have been shooting down Russian drones for the third day, show that Moscow is already testing the alliance. All of this is actually tied together in one knot. Vladimir Putin needs a provocation against NATO as a pretext for mobilization. Mobilization and North Koreans are needed because the Russian Federation's army is melting before our eyes. And Putin wants to use a freeze in the style of Tokayev just to get a breather and to prepare for a new strike. Ukraine's task is not to give the balding dictator this breather. That's why long-range strikes continue every night. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, I would be grateful. You can do this with any donation. The links and payment details are in the description of this video. That's all. Take care of yourself. Goodbye, everyone.